The sky trembled with a sound unlike any other, a piercing roar, sharp and relentless, as if lightning itself had taken form in steel and fire. For those who looked up in Europe or the Pacific, the silhouette was unmistakable. Twin booms stretched behind a central cockpit, carving through the clouds with a speed that stunned enemies and inspired allies. To the men who flew it, the P-38 Lightning was more than a fighter plane. It was survival, strength, and hope in a world teetering on the edge of despair. For older generations in America, the memory of those days is not just history in books. It is the echo of sacrifice, the bravery of young men barely out of school who strapped into a cockpit knowing each mission might be their last. The P-38 became their shield and their sword, a machine that carried them into battles across endless oceans and hostile skies. As we journey together through this story, we will uncover why the Lightning was unlike anything before it, why friend and foe alike remembered it with awe and fear, and why its legacy still resonates today. This is not only the tale of a remarkable aircraft, it is the story of courage, innovation, and the unshakable will of a generation. In the late 1930s, the world was bracing itself for a storm. Across Europe, Germany's Luftwaffe fielded sleek Messerschmitt fighters that tore across the skies with ruthless efficiency. In the Pacific, Japan's Zero reigned supreme, unmatched in maneuverability and feared by every Allied pilot who crossed its path. America, still catching its breath from the Great Depression, looked ahead and realized it needed something entirely new, an aircraft that could not only match these threats, but surpass them. The U.S. Army Air Corps issued a daring challenge: build a fighter that was faster, climbed higher, and flew farther than anything the world had yet seen. They needed a machine that could escort bombers deep into enemy territory, protect crews across vast oceans, and strike targets with devastating accuracy. The requirement was so bold it seemed almost impossible, but it was born from necessity. Lockheed, a relatively young company at the time, took that challenge and dreamed bigger than anyone imagined. Instead of a traditional single-engine design, their engineers envisioned something revolutionary: twin engines, twin tails, and concentrated firepower in the nose. It was radical, unconventional, and risky, but it was exactly the kind of leap forward the world demanded. The P-38 Lightning was not created in comfort or safety. It was forged in a moment when freedom itself stood on the edge of collapse. To understand the Lightning is to understand the urgency of its birth and the desperate need for a fighter that could carry the weight of a nation's hopes into battle. What emerged from Lockheed's gamble was unlike anything the world had ever seen. When the P-38 Lightning first lifted into the air, even seasoned pilots were struck by its strange, almost futuristic silhouette. Two long booms stretched back to twin tails, connected by a central pod where the pilot sat. An aircraft that looked more like something out of science fiction than the battlefields of the 1940s. Enemies who saw it from below quickly gave it a name that would stick: the fork-tailed devil. But the design was far more than a striking image. Beneath its unusual frame lay innovation that changed the very idea of what a fighter could be. The twin Allison V1710 engines gave the Lightning not just speed but endurance. It could climb faster than most adversaries, cruise across immense distances, and return home when other aircraft would have run dry. This endurance made it one of the few fighters capable of escorting bombers or striking distant targets far beyond the reach of traditional single-engine planes. Then, there was the concentrated firepower. Unlike fighters that mounted guns in the wings, the P-38 carried its arsenal in the nose: a 20mm cannon flanked by 4.50 caliber machine guns. This meant its bullets and shells converged perfectly at the point of aim, delivering devastating accuracy at ranges where other fighters' shots scattered wide. Pilots knew that if they could line up the target, the Lightning would finish the job. It was bold, unconventional, and intimidating. The P-38 was not just another fighter, it was a statement of American ingenuity, a declaration that even in the darkest of times, innovation and courage could create a weapon powerful enough to change the course of the skies. When the Lightning arrived in Europe, its greatest strength was immediately put to the test. The skies above Germany were some of the most dangerous in the world, crowded with flak bursts and prowling Luftwaffe fighters determined to tear Allied bombers from the sky. American B-17s and B-24s could deliver devastating blows to German industry, but without protection, they were easy prey. What those bombers needed was a guardian, an aircraft that could fly with them all the way to the target and back. The P-38 was that guardian. Its twin engines gave it the range to escort bombers on the long, punishing flights deep into enemy territory, even to Berlin itself. Few other fighters could travel so far and still fight when they arrived. To the bomber crews, watching the fork-tailed silhouettes slide into formation beside them meant reassurance. It meant someone was watching the skies, ready to dive at Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs before they could close in. For many bomber crews, the sight of lightnings overhead felt like the difference between life and death. Yet Europe's cold, damp climate tested the lightning in ways its designers had not foreseen. The complex turbochargers struggled in frigid air, and maintenance crews worked tirelessly to keep the fighters in the air. Pilots often had to fight not only the enemy but also the quirks of their own machines. Even so, the P-38 proved its worth. German pilots who once attacked bomber formations with confidence now hesitated when they saw the fork-tailed devil among them. The P-38's story in Europe was not without struggle, but it carved out its place as a shield in the darkest skies. It showed that long-range escort was possible, that courage and engineering together could give bomber crews a fighting chance. And in that role, the Lightning became more than a machine. It became a symbol of protection and resolve over a continent at war. In the Pacific, the vastness of the ocean shaped every battle. Islands were separated by hundreds of miles of open water, and the ability to reach distant targets often meant the difference between victory and defeat. This was where the P-38 Lightning truly came into its own. While many fighters lacked the range to cover such distances, the Lightning's twin engines and long wings carried it across the endless blue, giving American pilots the reach they desperately needed. It became the long arm of U.S. air power in a theater defined by distance. Against Japan's vaunted Zero, the P-38 proved a worthy adversary. The Zero was agile, almost dancing in the sky, but it could not match the Lightning's raw speed, power, and ability to climb. American pilots learned quickly to fight on their own terms, using the Lightning's superior acceleration to dive, strike with overwhelming firepower, and climb back out of reach. This boom and zoom style of combat turned the tables on an enemy that once seemed untouchable. For pilots who had watched friends fall to the Zero, the Lightning offered a new kind of hope, a plane that gave them the tools to fight back and win. Beyond dogfights, the Lightning's endurance meant it could patrol long stretches of ocean, intercept enemy bombers, and protect vulnerable carriers. It gave commanders options they had never had before, extending American influence across the Pacific in ways no other fighter could. To the men stationed on remote islands, the sight of a Lightning overhead was a reminder that they were not alone, that American reach stretched even to the farthest edges of the war. In those wide and lonely skies, the P-38 became more than a fighter. It was a bridge across the ocean, a lifeline for men fighting in some of the most isolated and brutal conditions of the war. It carried with it the promise that, no matter the distance, America's power and its will could find its way to the fight. Among all the missions flown by the Lightning, none captured the imagination of history more than the hunt for Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto. In April 1943, American intelligence intercepted Japanese communications, revealing Yamamoto's travel schedule in the Solomon Islands. For the United States, this was more than an opportunity. It was a chance to strike at the very architect of Pearl Harbor, the man whose plans had drawn America into the war. To reach him, however, required a feat no ordinary fighter could accomplish. His plane would be flying deep over Japanese-controlled territory, hundreds of miles from the nearest Allied base. Only the P-38, with its extraordinary range and speed, could hope to complete the mission. 16 Lightnings were dispatched, skimming the ocean at wave-top level for hours to avoid detection, guided by precise navigation and the weight of history pressing on every man's shoulders. When they intercepted Yamamoto's transport, The battle was swift and decisive. Japanese escorts tried to protect their commander, but the Lightning pilots dove in with the accuracy and firepower that defined their aircraft. Within moments, Yamamoto's plane spiraled into the jungle below, ending the life of the man once seen as untouchable. The success of the mission was more than a military victory. It sent a message across the Pacific. Japan's leaders were not beyond reach, and the tide of war was shifting. For the men who flew that mission, and for the nation that watched from afar, the P-38 Lightning became not just a fighter, but the hand of justice delivered on wings of steel. The mission against Yamamoto proved how powerful the P-38 could be, but it was the men who flew it that truly defined its legacy. Among them rose names that would become legends in American aviation, men whose skill and courage seemed almost larger than life. Richard Bong was one of those men. A farm boy from Wisconsin, he climbed into the cockpit of his Lightning and rewrote history. With 40 aerial victories, Bong became America's top ace of the war, every single one of his kills achieved in the P-38. He spoke modestly of his achievements, but to fellow pilots and to a nation following his exploits, he represented the spirit of determination that the Lightning itself embodied. Not far behind him was Thomas McGuire, another young man who carved his place in history with 38 victories. Fierce in battle and relentless in the air, McGuire proved again and again that in the hands of the right pilot, the P-38 was an unstoppable weapon. Together, Bong and McGuire became symbols of the war effort, ordinary Americans who found themselves in extraordinary circumstances, rising to the challenge with unmatched bravery. Their stories remind us that while the Lightning was a marvel of design, it was the men inside who gave it life. They turned cold steel into a living force, carrying not just bombs and bullets, but the hopes of their country. To remember their names is to remember that the true power of the P-38 was never only in its engines or guns, it was in the hands and hearts of those who flew it. The victories of Bong, McGuire, and countless others came at a price. Flying the P-38 was never easy, and for many it was as much a battle against the machine as against the enemy. In the frigid skies of Europe, the Lightning's complex turbochargers often froze or malfunctioned, leaving pilots fighting not only the Luftwaffe, but their own engines. In the Pacific, the oppressive heat and humidity tested both man and machine, pushing the Lightning to its limits on every mission. Pilots knew that each takeoff carried enormous risk. A sudden mechanical failure could be just as deadly as an enemy's bullet. Many who climbed into the distinctive cockpit never returned. Stories spread of men lost at sea after their engines failed over endless stretches of water, or of comrades who vanished in jungle battles where the Lightning could not shield them from fate. For the families back home, telegrams brought grief instead of glory, a stark reminder that progress and innovation were never free. Yet even with these challenges, pilots held on to the belief that the P-38 had saved more lives than it had cost. Survivors often spoke of the Lightning's toughness, of how its dual engines brought them home when one would have meant certain death. To them, the P-38 was both unforgiving and loyal, a machine that demanded everything but often gave them a second chance at life. In those sacrifices lay the truest measure of the Lightning's legacy. It was not just about what the aircraft achieved, but about the courage of those who faced danger in its cockpit, carrying the burden of war with steady hands and unshakable resolve. The sacrifices of the men in the cockpit were matched by another kind of battle fought thousands of miles from the front lines, inside America's factories. The P-38 was not only a triumph of design, it was the product of an industrial engine that few nations could rival. Lockheed, once a modest aircraft company, became a powerhouse of production as the war demanded more and more Lightnings. Assembly lines stretched across California, filled not just with seasoned engineers, but with young men and women who had never built an airplane before yet threw themselves into the task with determination. By the war's end, more than 10,000 P-38s had rolled off those lines. Each aircraft was a testament to America's ability to mobilize, innovate, and deliver on a scale the Axis powers could never match. Where Germany struggled to replace each aircraft it lost, and Japan fought to keep up with dwindling resources, the United States kept sending lightning after lightning into the skies. For every plane shot down in Europe or the Pacific, another quickly took its place. This relentless rhythm of production was more than numbers. It was a reflection of spirit. Families at home knew that the work of their hands might be the very thing that brought their sons or brothers back alive. The P-38 became not just a symbol of American ingenuity, but of collective sacrifice, where factory workers and pilots were bound together in the same cause. It proved that a free nation, united in purpose, could outbuild, outlast, and ultimately overcome any dictatorship that stood in its way. The vast production of the P-38 ensured that it left its mark not only on the battlefields of World War II, but on the memory of everyone who lived through those years. In combat, it proved its worth as both a fighter and a long-range escort, carrying the burden of countless missions over Europe and the Pacific. Its presence gave strength to bomber crews who knew they were not alone and offered confidence to commanders planning operations that stretched across oceans. The Lightning was more than a machine of war. It was a tool that gave the Allies reach, precision, and the ability to fight on their own terms. After the war, many P-38s were retired or scrapped, yet their legacy never faded. A number remained in service for years, while others found their way into museums or the hands of private collectors. At airshows today, when one of these rare Lightnings takes to the sky, its twin engines still roar with the same sharp note that once shook the battlefront. For veterans, the sight is enough to stir old memories of friends lost, of missions survived, of a youth spent in a cockpit facing impossible odds. The P-38 has also become a lasting symbol of what American innovation and determination can achieve. Its radical design challenged conventions, and its success proved that bold ideas could change the outcome of a global conflict. More than 80 years later, it continues to stand for resilience, creativity, and courage. To look at a Lightning today is to see more than riveted aluminum and spinning propellers. It is to see the reflection of a generation that refused to break, that sacrificed and built and fought so that freedom might endure. The fork-tailed devil remains a reminder that even in the darkest of skies, the light of liberty can still shine through. The story of the P-38 Lightning is not only about engines, speed, or firepower. It is about the spirit it carried into the skies. In every mission, whether escorting bombers over Europe or sweeping across the vast Pacific, it became a symbol of reach, protection, and resolve. For the men who flew it, the Lightning was both a weapon and a companion, a machine that demanded courage, but also gave them the strength to believe they could return home. Its legacy endures because it represents more than war. It represents the power of ingenuity, the willingness to take risks, and the sacrifices of a generation that refused to surrender in the face of tyranny. The fork-tailed devil terrified its enemies, but to Americans, it was the embodiment of hope, a promise that no matter how dark the night, Lightning would cut through and light the path to freedom. Today, when one of the few surviving Lightnings rises into the sky, its engines echo across time. It reminds us that liberty is never guaranteed, that it must be earned and defended with vision, unity, and courage. The P-38 was a thunderbolt of freedom in its day, and its story still speaks to us now. Freedom prevails when people dare to fight for it. Do you think the P-38 Lightning was the greatest fighter of World War II? Share your thoughts in the comments. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel so we can keep exploring these unforgettable stories from history together.